Amen. Welcome, Emmanuel, and welcome Jordan Harris's mom, who's also joining us right now. I want to thank everyone for worshiping together. And one of the thoughts as I was worshiping in the back with everyone was when Jesus was crucified, one of the things that happened during his crucifixion was that the curtain that separated the most holy of holy places, which is where the Jews believed God's presence lived, was torn. And there were two reasons for that, right? One of them is to show that we now, because of Christ's death, have access to God's presence. But what it also shows is that God's presence no longer should be seen as restricted to this one location, but that he is everywhere. And one of the things that I was very encouraged by just is realizing and feeling that God's presence was here as we were worshiping, right? It doesn't matter where we are, which location we're at, what distractions might be going on in your home or here in the office. One of the things that was so clear is that God's presence was here and is here with us now. And I tell you, that's an amazing thing, right? To know and believe that wherever we are, we worship God. Not in theory, but face to face, knowing that he is here with us, even here in our office. So today we will be talking about our final virtue, which is humility. Last week Scott talked about the vice of pride. Today we'll be talking about the virtue of humility. So let me begin by showing you three pictures. And so for those watching at home, lean into the slide a little bit as you're watching. So first of all, what do you see here? You see here this crazy miracle of science, a dog with two heads. But actually, it's two dogs, and one is hidden behind the owner's legs. What do you see here? A man standing against a tree looking out into a very reflective lake, enjoying the scene. Well, actually, it's a man laying down on a fallen tree. And what do you see here? This next picture actually went viral. A cute little girl with unnaturally skinny legs. Actually, it's a girl holding a bag of popcorn. See, the problem with these pictures is not that they were in any way manipulated or photoshopped or changed. Rather, what's the problem? Our perception of what really is happening was inaccurate. We didn't see the pictures clearly. And because of that lack of clarity, we saw something false, something distorted, skewed. You see, fundamentally, the core issue with pride is not our boastfulness or vanity. I think it's overly simplistic. I think fundamentally the core issue or core problem with pride is an inaccurate view of reality. We become arrogant because we have this skewed view of ourselves, others, and God. Thus, pride, I think, is actually more synonymous not with narcissism, which is what we oftentimes think, but that pride is more synonymous with ignorance, right? That is more synonymous with ignorance. And thus, very interestingly, philosopher Carl Clifton Soderstrom suggests in his book, The Cardinal and the Deadly, that the opposite of pride is actually wisdom. That the opposite virtue of pride is actually wisdom. Wisdom is about knowing that which is true. Wisdom is about gaining an accurate view of our reality. And so, as Bernard of Clairvaux, a French monk who lived in 1000 AD, says, there is nothing more effective more adapted to the acquiring of humility than to find out the truth about oneself. If you lack self-knowledge, you will possess neither the fear of God nor humility. Humility is self-knowledge perfected. Humility is self-knowledge perfected. And this quote is really the main message of my sermon. Humility is not about what we oftentimes think, self-humiliation or self-degradation, just feeling low about ourselves. Instead, humility is actually about seeing ourselves clearly. If anything, our usual definition of humility, this self-humiliation, self-degradation, is actually the flip side of the same coin of pride. It's still this skewed view of ourselves, but a negative skewed view. Instead, humility is about seeing ourselves clearly and accurately. So let's talk about what true humility is. I want to do so by using a diagram to guide us. Humility is about seeing three things very clearly. It's about being able to celebrate clearly and authentically our strengths. It's about knowing how we are sufficient in the Lord. At the same time, it's about not denying, but accepting and embracing our weaknesses, knowing how we are deficient. But it's also, finally, acknowledging what we are not, to clearly see what we are not, knowing that we are not God, but instead are finite. And this is what humility is about, an ever-perfecting self-knowledge of ourselves. So let's look at the three spheres and see how we see them in our passage. When you look at 1 Corinthians 15, initially you would think Paul seems very self-deprecating. But when you look closely, you see actually that he's not. In verse 10, he says that because of the grace of God, I am what I am. And what is he saying that he is? Right? He's saying and embracing who he is as what? The pioneering apostle to the Gentiles throughout the known world at that time. Who is he? He's saying that before he was the persecutor of the church, but now he has become the most prolific planter of churches. Later on in verse 10, he says that he has worked harder than any of the other apostles. Right? Here Paul is what? Boasting about his effort and work that he has put into his ministry. Which not only that, but also implies that I have accomplished more. I have accomplished a great deal because of the effort and work I have put into this ministry. So you see here, Paul is not being self-deprecating, but he embraces, acknowledges, and celebrates who he has become and what he has done. True humility never means being dismissive, I think, of our strengths and successes. Even as I think about our congregation at Emmanuel, all of us have achieved many accomplishments in our lives, our jobs, our families. All of us have incredible life experiences that have shaped where you are now in life. All of us have been used by God in some way, whether big or small. All of us are talented and skilled people whom God has gifted in so many ways. I just want to say, even yesterday as we were setting up, seeing Jordan and Jared Pettigrew come here and set up everything, prepare everything, and as I was preparing in the office, it seemed like they were speaking in this foreign language. All this tech things about what they had to fix and what they needed to buy and what they had to set up. But because of that way God created them, we are able to do this. Where 100 people plus the people who have braved themselves and come to this office are able to worship together. Byproduct of humility is not a sense of inferiority, but a sense of self-worth and self-value. And thus, he continues and says, we are created uniquely in God's image. This leads to a biblical and genuine self-esteem consisting of a healthy sense of self-worth that is grateful for the gifts one has been given. Secondly, I think biblical humility is also about accepting our shortcomings and failures. This we see a little bit more obviously here in this passage. Paul says, I am the least of the apostles, unworthy to be called an apostle because I persecuted the church of God. And so even though here in this passage, Paul talks about what he has done and what he has become, he is still very aware of his unworthiness. And this is not some false self-esteem or a false humility. Rather, Paul has not forgotten, nor does he ever dismiss his past crimes. But what's more important than that is this. It's not just about his past. That Paul isn't just fixated on his past crimes, and thus this passage is not applicable to us. But actually it's this. His past failures are a continual reminder of his current fallenness. That his past failures are this continual reminder of his current fallenness. He does not say what? That he was the least of the apostles. What does he say? That he is the least and that he is unworthy. Paul knows that he is forgiven and that he is being redeemed. But he also knows that the heart that caused him to persecute Christians in the past is the same heart that exists within him that causes him to fail and sin in the present. And this passage, Paul is able to hold both realities of who he is in tension. That he celebrates who he is and what he has become. And at the same time, he mourns the heart of sin that he existed in the past that persecuted. But it is the same heart that now sins and fails in the present. And so we also must hold these two realities in tension in our own lives, to be mindful of no matter what we've been able to achieve, no matter what people say about us, to not forget that we are sinners with flaws and weaknesses. Though we look put together on this outside, we cannot forget how much we lack on the inside. And finally, we must also acknowledge our finiteness. This illustration is for one of our church members attending here, and it was very providential that she was invited to, that she came. Vince Lombardi was the famous coach for the Green Bay Packers in the 1960s. The Super Bowl trophy is actually named after this coach. And there's a myth that's told about him where the story goes like this. He went to a championship playoff game, and his wife could not attend. And at this game, no one thought the Packers could win, and that hasn't changed very much now. But against all odds, they did win. So that night, he came back home very late, and his wife was already in bed sleeping. And so he got into his bed very quietly, trying to make sure that she doesn't wake up. But as he slipped in, his cold feet touched her leg, and she yelled out loud, "God, your feet is freezing." To which Coach Vince Lombardi quickly replied, "Honey, when we are in bed, please just call me Vince." It's a funny story, but it's untrue. Well, most likely untrue. But what it does illustrate is actually very true for us all, right? Carl Clifton Saunderson said that pride decenters our soul's orientation such that the prideful person perceives and acts as if he or she is at the center of existence. See, the heart of pride desires to become like God and to be in control, to get all the glory. This was the temptation that caused Adam and Eve to fall, and is what causes us to continually fall now. But as we look at our passage, we see that Paul never confuses who he is and who God is. He sees that very clearly. He is aware that he's not autonomous, but instead he lives to serve his Creator. He's aware that he does not rule over the churches, but whose churches does he say they belong to? God. He's aware that he's finite and not all-powerful, and thus he says over and over again that everything he does is because of what? The grace and power of God. Paul clearly sees that he is not God, but instead a mortal man who lived and follows the will of his divine Creator. You see, I think for many of us, our definition of humility is much too simplistic. It's not about being self-deprecating. It's not about being self-effacing. Rather, humility is about clearly seeing who we are and who we are not. And as we grow in this self-knowledge, we'll grow in our humility. So then, how do we know we are growing in humility? What's the evidence of that growth? The byproduct of humility, I think, will always be the presence of worship in our hearts. That the true byproduct of humility is the presence of worship in our hearts. That I think one of the key distinctives between arrogance and humility is not the act of boasting, but it's boasting that's worshipless. Right? And we see this with a lot of athletes, Christian athletes, when they are here at these interviews, like, for example, Carson Wentz, or Nick Foles, or Zach Ertz. You see them boasting about their skills, but it's worshipful boasting, not of themselves, but of the Lord. That I think the key distinctive between arrogance, pride, and humility is not about being proud of ourselves, but it's pride for ourselves that does not lead to utter thankfulness. So let's look at each sphere and see how it leads us to worship. In 1982, the Oscars for Best Picture went to a historical drama called The Chariots of Fire. It's based on the story of Eric Liddell, who ran the 1924 Olympics. He was a very devout Christian who eventually went on to become a missionary in China. He switched from the 100-meter race to the 400-meter race in order to avoid running on Sunday. And he ended up winning the gold medal for that event and also breaking a new world record at that time. He was an incredible sprinter who had a very unorthodox running style that actually other competitors sometimes made fun of because he ran with his head cocked back. And one of his most famous quotes, which is actually not attributed to him but is sort of redacted for the movie, was this: "The God made me fast, but when I run, I feel his pleasure." God made me fast, and when I run, I feel his pleasure. And I think this quote is a great demonstration of humility, of true humility. Psalm 139:14 says, "I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well." Humility embraces our strengths because it acknowledges that it's God who made us this way. God made me fast. God made me technically gifted. God made me musical. God made me able to do all of these things. God made me this way. Thus, when we minimize who we are, when we minimize what we've been able to accomplish, we deny ourselves an opportunity to be in awe of our God who uniquely created us. We deny ourselves the opportunity to be in awe of our God who uniquely created us. True humility should not be marked with false modesty, but by a heart that worships our Creator who made us uniquely and gifted us uniquely for his glory. Secondly, accepting our weaknesses should also lead to worship. Paul was very aware of his sinfulness and shortcomings. I don't think he ever forgot, as you think about Paul, particularly the scene in Acts 7, right? Where in Acts 7 we hear that he was holding the cloaks of the leaders who stoned Stephen to death. And just think, if you experienced that, and that you later on became someone who persecuted Christians and executed Christians, how much Paul probably never forgot those experiences. That I don't think Paul ever got rid of those images in his head. That as a human, I bet you Acts 7 continually played on, sometimes at night. But what's so interesting here is that Paul says that he is unworthy to be called an apostle. He has never forgotten his crimes. And that weighs so heavily on who he is. And thus he says, I am unworthy to be called an apostle. But what's so interesting is this. He never says what? That because I'm unworthy, I am unqualified to be an apostle. Right? He does not say, I am the least of the apostles and thus unqualified. He says, no, I am the least of the apostles and thus unworthy. In other words, that he knows he is utterly unworthy. But he also knows that what qualifies him to this calling is not who he is, but because of something outside of himself. The grace of God. And thus twice he repeats in verse 10 that what he has done and who he has become is because of the grace of God. He has not forgotten his crimes. He has not forgotten the people that he persecuted. The face of Stephen as he watched him be executed. And feels utterly unworthy, I think, throughout his ministry. And yet he never feels disqualified to be called an apostle. Because he knows what qualifies him. It's not who he is, what he has done, or what he has been able to accomplish. But because of the grace of God. He does not say, I work harder than all the other apostles in order to qualify himself. He never says that, right? He works harder than all the other apostles. Why? Because he understands how unworthy he is, and yet was shown the grace of God, and is compelled to ministry. Do you see? His acceptance of his unworthiness led to this immeasurable worship in his heart. Because of all the people, he has not forgotten who he is. And yet he knows he is qualified to be an apostle and worships his Savior who has forgiven and redeemed him. And finally, not only does clearly seeing our strengths and our weaknesses lead to worship, but also acknowledging our finiteness. In 1995, I went to Kenya for a missions trip and spent some time in this area of Kenya, western Kenya, called Masai Mara. A very, very remote place in Kenya. And because of the lack of light pollution and the flat terrain in the sky at night was incredible. And in some ways, I know it's a little bit harder to see out there in your homes, but the stars were just amazing. And you would stand there, and almost every night I would stand outside when everybody had gone to sleep to stare at the stars. It was not just clear, but it was just packed. The number of stars, seeing actually the Milky Way. And there, because of the flat terrain and the latitude, it looked like this planetarium, right? It was just immeasurably amazing looking at that. And the overwhelming sensation that I had was feeling so small. I felt at that moment so tiny, so finite, so inconsequential. And I know that many of you have probably experienced this, right? Anytime you have gone hiking outdoors or climbed up a mountain or just been someplace where you get to see the nighttime stars, what's so interesting is that all of us experience this sense of feeling small. But what I think is so interesting is that sense of smallness does not lead oftentimes to the sense of feeling dejected or morose. But rather, instead of being a negative experience, most of us, when we experience the sense of smallness, actually experience a very profound sensation, right? That the irony is that feeling small led me to this incredible sense of awe. Not to fixate on myself and my mortality, but instead to be fixated on the vastness of the universe, the grandeur and the greatness of what I was looking at. The irony of feeling small is that it leads us to look at that which is bigger than us. And I think that is true biblical humility. That much like that experience, when we come to a place where we clearly see who we are, our finiteness, our smallness, that we are mortal, that it should not lead that self-knowledge to despondency, to fixate on ourselves, but actually, in true biblical humility, it leads to look at the vastness and the greatness of our God. That it leads to worship. That contemplating our finiteness does not lead to being fixated on ourselves, but instead it causes us to lose ourselves and to be drawn towards the divine other that is glorious, holy, and infinite. You see, true biblical humility is not seen by our self-deprecation, by lowering ourselves. Rather, it's seen by our worship. As C.S. Lewis said, humility is not thinking less of yourself, but thinking of yourself less. That true humility always leads to a greater thankfulness and awe in our God. As I close, I shared this story many years ago, but when our kids were young, Michelle went up to visit her mom, and she took two of our boys, and Jacob stayed with me for the weekend. He was probably, I think, 6. All weekend, Jacob was glued to my hip. Everywhere I went, he was there. When I went into the kitchen, Jacob was right next to me watching me. When I opened up the fridge, he was right there looking at what I was grabbing. When I sat down, when I went into the bathroom, he opened the door, came in, and sat there watching. Jacob's probably very glad he's watching this at home, and only his brothers are laughing at him than everybody else in the audience. He was glued to my hip. But that Sunday, I had to preach. And so that morning, I needed some time by myself to prepare. So I turned on the TV down in our basement, and I said, Jacob, you can watch as much TV as you want. Sit down there and watch. Give me some time to prepare. So I set him up, and I went upstairs to start preparing. And literally 5 minutes, I hear the TV turn off, and I hear the noise of his feet going up the stairs, coming down the hallway, and my door open, and he sits on the bed behind me, staring at me. And I said to Jacob, what are you doing? You can watch TV. I need to prepare. What are you doing? Come on. And he said this, I can't help it. I get distracted by you. I can't help it. I get distracted by you. What's so interesting is this. Do you know what sermon I was preparing? It's on Malachi about worship. And so I deleted that whole last page and shared that illustration. I have yet to find, I think, a more perfect illustration of what true humility is. That true humility is that I can't help it, God. I get distracted by you. I can't focus on myself. I can't focus on where I am not. I can't focus on comparing myself with other people. I can't focus on what I have accomplished. Instead, Lord, I am distracted by who you are. That you created me in this amazing and unique way. Thank you. That you have forgiven me, though I am the worst of sinners. Thank you. And that you are an infinite, divine God who loves me, though I'm finite and mortal. Thank you. That's worship. That's worship. To be distracted by God who created us, forgives us, and is infinitely greater than us. Let's pray.